All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking into something that I think you've probably thought about, at least implicitly, even if you haven't heard the specific term for it, and that is the problem of dirty hands. Basically, this question that's been floating around in political philosophy forever, and it's a big one, when is it okay, if ever, for political leaders to basically ditch the whole morality thing, the morals that we all live by, to do something good, to get a good outcome, or to avoid some kind of huge disaster? Like, they're serving the people, right? They're trying to help people, but sometimes maybe got to do something that's, not so good.
Right. You've hit on a really thorny issue. I mean, it's one that a lot of people kind of viscerally get. Like, they sense this conflict, but it can be tricky to really pin down why it's so troubling. So to help us unpack this, to really dive deep, as we like to do, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, you guessed it, the problem of dirty hands.
Perfect.
It's a really comprehensive piece, really lays out the major ideas and figures in the whole debate.
Yeah. So to give you a taste of what we're talking about, let's start with a juicy quote from Anthony Trollope's novel, The Way We Live Now. Lady Carberry, who is quite the, let's just say she's a character.
Oh, yeah.
She basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like, look, if you can do something great, something that benefits all of humanity just by getting people to believe in it, well, isn't that person a hero? Even if they, bend the rules a bit. She's a big fan of what she calls, get this, beneficent audacity.
Beneficent audacity. I love that.
It basically means those who achieve great things don't have to play by the ordinary rules.
It's interesting, right? She's almost like, yeah, so what? Maybe some iffy stuff went down, but look at the amazing results. But philosophically, it's not usually that simple. There's this underlying uneasiness. Take W.H. Auden's poem, Spain, where he talks about, and this is a pretty intense line, the deliberate increase in the chances of death, the conscious acceptance of guilt in the necessary murder. Yeah, so unlike Lady Carberry, there's this acknowledgement that even if you have to do something, even if it's seen as necessary, it can still be deeply wrong. Like, there's a stain that remains.
So this struggle between doing good and, maybe doing something bad to get there, it's been around forever, it seems. But where does the idea, this dirty hands phrase, where does it come from? Where did it start?
Well, thinkers have been wrestling with this forever, but the modern version, how we talk about it now, it really comes from Machiavelli.
Yeah.
He's the one who famously said a ruler needs to learn how to, quote, not be good. But the term dirty hands itself,
Yeah.
it's mainly thanks to Michael Walzer, specifically in a paper he wrote in 1973, where he borrows the term from a Sartre play, actually, and then later on in his book, Just and Unjust Wars.
That's where he goes into the whole, the Allied bombing of German cities in World War II, right?
Exactly. So early in the war, right, it looked like a Nazi victory was a real possibility. Like what would happen if they actually won. Walzer called this kind of situation a supreme emergency. He argued, and this was kind of controversial even at the time, that maybe the bombing of German cities, even though it meant civilian casualties, maybe that was okay. At that point, it was all about preventing something even worse. He thought the potential destruction of, basic human values under the Nazis, it was so big, so terrifying, that it outweighed the horror of killing civilians.
But then he changed his mind on that, right?
He did. It's a really important shift. Later on, he came to condemn the continuation of those city bombings as the war went on.
Okay.
And he was firmly against the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So his view evolved. He came to believe that supreme emergency justification, it didn't hold anymore. Once the immediate threat, the threat to, the very existence of democratic values, once that had receded, the justification was gone.
So how did Walzer, this is where it gets really interesting to me. How did he sort of define when dirty hands was even a possibility? Like, what were his criteria?
He got a lot stricter, a lot more narrow in how he applied it. He basically said that dirty hands, this justification, it only works in what he called, and I'm using his words here, a supreme emergency, which he defined very specifically. It had to be a situation where, and I quote, the ongoingness of the community is at stake, or when the danger that we face is nothing less than communal death. So basically, the bar got really, really high.
Yeah.
Like, it had to be an existential threat to the entire community. Nothing short of that would do.
Which is such a, like, the Stanford Encyclopedia, they talk about this, this dramatic shift, It's like, well, wait a minute, this is a huge difference. And it makes you think.
It really does.
Yeah.
Think about one of his earlier examples from that 1973 paper. He talks about, a leader, maybe they have a suspected terrorist, and they're thinking, okay, do I torture this person to get information that might prevent a huge attack.
Wow.
It's horrible, right?
Yeah.
But under Waltzer's later view, that wouldn't necessarily count as communal death. It's terrible, but it doesn't rise to that level of, like, the complete annihilation of the community. So you can see how his thinking about what qualified as a dirty hand situation, it really, really narrowed.
It's almost like early on he was using dirty hands more loosely, right? Like it was any time a politician had to do something, morally iffy.
You're totally right. In that same 1973 piece, he says something like, "It's easy to get your hands dirty in politics, and it's often the right thing to do."
Yeah.
So the first part, that's just acknowledging that politics is messy, right?
Right.
The second part, it's like he's giving permission to do things that, maybe aren't so kosher. It's definitely not the same as this very, very strict supreme emergency idea he develops later.
So Walser is like the main guy when it comes to dirty hands. But this idea of, leaders having to operate under a different set of moral rules, it's not brand new.
Right. Oh, not at all. We already talked about Machiavelli, and the encyclopedia talks about Max Weber, too. He made this really important distinction between what he called an ethic of responsibility and an ethic of ultimate ends. The ethic of responsibility is all about the real-world consequences of your actions. So if you're a politician, you have to think, okay, what's actually going to happen because of what I do? You're responsible for those outcomes, right?
Right.
And then there's the ethic of ultimate ends. That's sticking to your morals no matter what, even if it means bad things might happen because of it. So Weber's point is that politics, it forces you to balance these two. Sometimes to do what's best for the community, you might have to do something that, wouldn't exactly pass a strict ethical test.
So it wasn't just like end of the world scenarios for Weber. It was more about like the day-to-day reality of what it means to be a leader.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's saying that making these decisions, the decisions that affect so many people, it just inherently involves a different kind of moral calculation. Like a regular person can just focus on their own conscience, but a politician, they have to think about all these consequences. It's a whole other ballgame.
So we've got this spectrum, right?
Yeah.
On one end, it's like, oh my God, total disaster, supreme emergency, like everything's on the line. But then there's this whole other side, this idea that, hey, just regular politics, it sometimes forces people to make tough calls that maybe aren't perfectly clean.
That's a great way to put it. The encyclopedia quotes Neil Levy, and he says, "Dirty actions are part and parcel of ordinary political life." And he points to things like, deal-making, compromising with groups you might not like, or handing out favors to get things done.
So is all that stuff actually immoral, though?
Right. That's the question. Like, is it all dirty hands in the sense that we're talking about it?
Yeah.
The encyclopedia uses the example of, let's say you're a politician and you have to appoint someone to a cabinet position.
Yeah.
Maybe there's someone super qualified, but they're not really connected politically. And then there's this other person who's maybe not as competent, but they're a big player in your coalition. And you need their support to stay in power and to get things done. So you appoint this second person. Is that a morally bad thing to do?
Right, right.
So the encyclopedia suggests that, yeah, maybe it's regrettable. Maybe you even feel a little icky about it. But is it a major moral violation? Probably not. They point to Bernard Williams. He makes this helpful distinction between what he calls morally disagreeable or distasteful actions and things that are truly morally criminal, like murder or torture.
Yeah.
So the politically expedient appointment, that might fall into the disagreeable category.
It's not great, but...
Right. It's not great, but maybe not full-on evil.
Okay, so Williams also talks about regret and remorse, as a kind of a sign that something was actually morally wrong.
Right.
But the encyclopedia makes a good point. They say, look, don't confuse just, being bummed out about a decision with real moral remorse.
Exactly. Like sometimes you make a tough choice and you're just like, I wish I didn't have to do that.
Right, exactly.
But that's not the same as feeling genuine remorse, where you're like, oh my God, I violated a moral principle I truly believe in. We have to be careful not to lump those two together.
Okay.
Especially since, like we said, Walzer later really narrowed his definition of dirty hands to these really serious injustices, like torture or murder.
So to add another layer to all of this, the entry talks about this other idea, spattered hands. It's by Jennifer Rubinstein.
How does that fit in?
So Rubinstein is talking about situations where, something bad happens as a result of your actions, but you weren't the one who actually did the bad thing, and it wasn't what you intended. The example she uses is aid workers in a war zone. So their whole goal is to help people, to relieve suffering. But sometimes the aid they're giving, it might end up getting used by one of the sides in the conflict, which actually makes the farting worse and causes more harm.
So her point is, that's not really dirty hands, because the aid workers aren't intentionally doing something bad to achieve some good outcome. It's bad stuff happening, and their hands are kind of spattered because of it. But it's different from the intentional wrongdoing of dirty hands.
Okay, that's a helpful distinction. So the Stanford Encyclopedia, they lay out 5 big questions about the whole dirty hands problem to kind of make sense of all this. What are they?
All right, so the big 5 are, first, is the dirty hands thing just a big misunderstanding? Is it a conceptual confusion? Second, is it about stepping outside of morality altogether, or is it some kind of internal conflict within morality itself? Third, is it something that only happens in politics, or can it pop up in other parts of life too? Fourth, how do we even describe the situations where dirty hands might come into play? And fifth, how does it relate to the ideas of moral dilemmas and moral absolutism?
So let's start with that first one. Is this whole idea of dirty hands just a big philosophical it seems kind of paradoxical, right? I mean, how can it be right to do what is wrong?
It does seem contradictory. But the people who defend dirty hands, they say, look, we're not saying that a single act can be both right and wrong at the same time in the same way.
Okay.
What they're saying is that the entire situation, especially when it's like one of those extreme situations, it can be both wrong according to, our normal ideas of morality, but also, unfortunately, the only thing you can really do to prevent a greater evil.
Okay, so it's like, yeah, it's wrong, but...
Yeah, it's wrong, but you kind of got to do it.
But you got to do it, yeah. And I know some philosophers, like Kai Nielsen, they just reject the whole thing. They're like, this is nonsense. It's a conceptual confusion.
No, exactly. Nielsen, he's not strictly a utilitarian, but he leans that way. His argument is basically, look, you're always obligated to choose the lesser of two evils.
Right.
Do the thing that produces the best outcome, even if that means doing something you wouldn't normally do.
Yeah.
He says that feeling guilty doesn't automatically mean you are guilty.
Okay, so then on the other side of things, you've got the absolutists. They say certain moral rules, you just never break them, period, no matter what.
Exactly. Like, if you truly believe that something is always wrong, no matter the consequences, then the whole dirty hands dilemma just doesn't come up. There's no debate. Take the example of killing innocent people.
Yeah.
If you believe that's absolutely always forbidden, then something like the World War II bombings, that's not even a question. You just don't do it. There's a line you can't cross no matter how bad things look.
So like Augustine, Aquinas, Kant, they would all be in that camp. Right?
Yep, those are some of the big names in moral absolutism.
Okay, so if it's not a misunderstanding and it's not totally explained by, just always picking the least bad option or by absolute rules, then how do we make sense of it? How can we override these moral rules in these extreme situations?
One way to think about it is that morality isn't the only thing that matters.
Okay.
Like, it's important, but sometimes there are other non-moral oughts that might trump it, especially in politics.
So it's like there's morality, but then there are these other things that also
Exactly.
obligate you in a way.
Exactly. And they might be even more compelling in certain cases.
Okay.
So, for example, if there's this really dire situation, a true necessity to protect the community, to save people from disaster, that might be seen as an ought that can override a moral ought. You might still feel terrible about it. You might even have remorse, but you still got to do it. It's the right thing to do, even if it's morally wrong.
So it's not just about like being selfish or doing what's politically convenient. It's not that simple.
Right. It's not just saying, oh, I'm going to ditch my morals because it's good for me or my career. The whole point of dirty hands is that you're doing something wrong, but you're doing it because it's necessary. You're doing it because it's ultimately, in that specific horrific context, the right thing to do.
So this goes back to Machiavelli again, right?
It does.
When he talked about necessity overriding traditional morality. Like sometimes the survival of the state, what he called reasons of state, it trumps everything else.
Exactly.
Okay, so the encyclopedia also talks about dominance versus comprehensiveness of morality. What do they mean by that?
So comprehensiveness just means that morals, they matter in every decision we make. It's always something to consider. Dominance means that when moral considerations come up, they always win. They trump every other kind of consideration, whether it's political, economic, whatever. So dirty hands theory, it's basically saying, yeah, morals are comprehensive, but they're not always dominant. Sometimes in these really extreme cases, something else, like the survival of the community, it might have to come first.
And that's different from political realism.
Right, big time. Political realists, they often deny that morals even matter in politics, especially in international relations. They might say, look, there's no such thing as ethics between countries.
It's a dog-eat-dog world.
Exactly. It's all about power and self-interest. So one big difference here is that realists, they don't usually feel conflicted or regretful about doing things that might seem morally wrong. They just see it as the way the game is played. But with dirty hands, there's always this tension, this sense that you've had to do something you shouldn't have done.
So this necessity that sometimes trumps morality, it's not like some kind of fate or destiny, is it?
No, it's not like you have no choice. It's more like in certain situations, there's this super compelling reason to do something, even if it goes against your morals.
So it's like you have a choice, bud.
Yeah.
You have a terrible choice.
You have a terrible choice.
Mm-hmm.
And usually it's about, avoiding some kind of catastrophe for the whole community. Like if you don't do this terrible thing, something even worse is going to happen. And that makes it necessary.
Okay, so that makes sense.
So remember Hobbes.
Yeah.
He had this argument that moral laws, they only apply if you're alive, right?
Yeah.
If following a moral rule means you get killed, well, then the rule doesn't apply anymore. It's like self-defense, but on a societal level.
Yeah. So it all ties back to that supreme emergency idea.
Exactly. It's about acting to prevent the collapse of everything. But the encyclopedia brings up a really important counterpoint. They talk about a woman named Hanna Levy-Haas. She was a survivor of the Belsen concentration camp. And she talks about this argument she had with another prisoner.
Okay.
The other prisoner was saying that, in the camps, there was no morality.
Just survival.
Yeah, it was all about survival.
Right.
But Levy-Haas, she totally rejected that.
Mm.
She saw it as giving in to evil, as abandoning the things that make us human. Her experience shows that even in the most extreme circumstances, even when facing unimaginable horror, people still argue about whether survival really trumps everything else.
So maybe it's not about going outside of morality, but about a conflict within morality itself, like different moral principles clashing with each other.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
We talked about Weber and the tension between ultimate ends and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Walter also suggests that there's this fundamental conflict between the morality of individual rights and, what you might call a utilitarianism of extremity. Like, in those really dire situations, maybe the need to prevent mass suffering, it outweighs individual rights.
And then there's that idea of role morality, right?
Right.
Where a leader has these special duties that might actually supersede general moral principles.
Exactly. Like, a regular person can focus on their own conscience, but a leader, their primary duty is to the community, to its survival. Kind of like what Lady Carberry was saying. Their job is to protect the community, even if it means doing things that would normally be considered wrong.
So Walter talks about, what political leaders are for.
Yes.
And he seems to think that their main role is to safeguard the community no matter what.
Right. But the encyclopedia critiques that role morality thing pretty hard.
Really? How so?
So they point out that usually when we talk about role-based ethics, those obligations, those duties that come with the role, they're based on some deeper, more general moral principles. Like a lawyer has a duty to keep their client's secrets, right? That's part of their role. But we all agree that there are limits to that. If the client is about to commit a crime that would hurt someone, the lawyer has to break confidentiality. The duty to protect innocent life, that overrides the role-based duty. So the encyclopedia argues that dirty hands seems to flip that logic.
It's backward.
It's backwards. It's like the specific duty of the leader to protect the community is somehow more important than the basic moral principles that give that role its authority in the first place.
It's like saying the ends justify the means no matter what.
Yeah, and the encyclopedia also points out that Walzer, he kind of conflates the value of human life itself with the preservation of a specific way of life. Like preventing mass death. That's one thing. That's pretty clear-cut. But is it okay to do terrible things just to preserve a particular culture, a particular set of political institutions? It's not so obvious.
That gets complicated. And the entry also talks about how Walzer focuses mostly on, states, countries, and is hesitant to extend the dirty hands justification to non-state actors, like terrorist groups.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So he seems to say it's okay for a government to do things that might look like terrorism if they're facing a supreme emergency.
Okay.
But when terrorists do similar things, he's super critical. The encyclopedia points out that he's basically applying a double standard.
Because they both claim they have no other choice.
Right. They both say, we have no other choice.
Right.
But Walzer's more willing to accept that excuse from governments than from terrorists.
But he does say that in some cases, like in a genocide, maybe terrorism would be justified.
He does, yeah. In some of his later writing, he kind of concedes that point. He says it might be justifiable in a genocide or even just excusable in some other extreme cases. Like he uses this example of Jewish militants killing German civilians during World War II. But overall, his position on terrorism is kind of confusing and inconsistent.
It's like he's struggling with it. And the encyclopedia talks about how he uses the words justifiable and excusable almost interchangeably, which seems like a pretty big difference.
It is.
What do you think is going on there?
I think it shows how uncomfortable he is with the whole idea of, actually justifying something that's clearly morally wrong. Justifiable means it was the right thing to do, all things considered. Excusable means it was wrong, but there were reasons that kind of make it understandable. So I think Walzer, he wants to say that these dirty hands acts, they're necessary, but he doesn't want to let the people who do them off the hook completely.
He doesn't want to say that it's okay. So there's this philosopher, Tamar Meisels. She thinks that dirty hands is more about an excuse than a justification. Like, you can explain why someone did it, but you can't really say it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting take, but the encyclopedia points out that it's not really the standard way of thinking about it.
So is this dirty hands thing something that only happens in politics, or can it happen in other areas of life too?
So Walzer, he focuses mainly on politics,
Yeah.
especially in those really intense situations. But he does say, briefly, that, yeah, you could see similar stuff happening in other areas of life. But most of his work is about political leaders. Other philosophers, though, like Michael Stocker, they're like, hey, wait a minute, this is a human dilemma, not just a political one.
So how's dirty hands different from just a regular moral dilemma?
That's a good question. They both involve, tough choices where there's no easy answer.
Right, you're screwed either way.
Exactly. But the big difference is this idea of necessity. With a moral dilemma, you've got multiple options, and none of them are great. No matter what you choose, someone's going to get hurt, or some principle is going to be violated.
So it's like pick your poison.
Yeah, pick your poison. But with dirty hands, there's this sense that one option, and usually it's about protecting the community, that one option is the only way to go. It's necessary, even if it means doing something morally wrong.
It's the lesser of two evils.
Right. It's not just about choosing between bad options. It's about accepting that you have to do something bad to prevent something worse.
So it's not always just an emergency situation, right?
No, the encyclopedia talks about other ways to think about the kinds of circumstances where dirty hands might come up. Like, one is that politics itself, just the way it works, the compromises, the deals, the power struggles, all of that, it just inherently involves moral risks.
It's like built into the system.
Yeah, exactly. Another idea is this thing called moral isolation, which is kind of a scary thought.
Okay, what's it?
It's the idea that if everyone around you is breaking the rules, if morality is basically broken down, then you might feel pressured to do the same, even if you don't want to, like just to survive.
Yeah.
Or to protect the people you care about.
So it's like, if everyone else is cheating, do you cheat too?
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
Okay.
And then there's this other idea, extrication, that's about dealing with the consequences of past wrongs or situations where the whole system is just messed up.
So like inherited problems.
Yeah, exactly. And in those cases, maybe you have to keep doing something wrong, at least for a while, to eventually make things better.
Okay.
It's like you can't just snap your fingers and fix everything. Sometimes it takes time, and sometimes it involves making tough compromises along the way.
The encyclopedia mentions a couple of more recent examples of this kind of thinking. Like there's Cecile Faber. She talks about second-best justifications for things like spying.
Yeah, so her argument is that even if spying is generally wrong, it might be okay in certain cases if it's done for a good cause and if there's no other way to get the information you need, like if you're trying to stop a terrorist attack or prevent a war. But she emphasizes that even when it's justified, it still leaves a moral stain. It's still not a good thing to do.
So it's like it's the least bad option, but it's still bad.
Exactly. And there's another philosopher, Victor Tadros. He makes a similar argument about fighting in an unjust war. Like, even if the war itself is wrong, maybe it's okay to join the fight if you're trying to make sure the violence doesn't get even worse. But the encyclopedia points out that, in a big organization like the military, one person might not be able to make that much of a difference.
Right, right. And this extrication thing, it seems like the necessity that makes a dirty hands act okay, it shouldn't be seen as permanent, right?
Absolutely. The encyclopedia stresses that whoever does one of these dirty hands things, especially if they're a political leader, they have a responsibility to try and change the circumstances that led to it.
Yeah.
Like, if you had to torture someone to prevent a bombing. Okay, but now you have to work to prevent future bombings so that you never have to do that again. You can't just say, well, that's how it is. Necessity made me do it.
So let's talk about the dirty hands of citizens.
Right.
What about us?
Right.
If our leaders are doing questionable things in our name, what's our responsibility, especially in a democracy?
It's a tough one. Walzer, he points out this kind of paradox where we want our leaders to be both good people and also people who can do what needs to be done, even if it's morally wrong in those extreme situations.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we want them to have a conscience, but also be willing to ignore it when necessary.
Right.
And some philosophers, they say that if we give our leaders the power to act on our behalf, then we share in the responsibility for what they do. Like if they get their hands dirty, our hands get dirty too.
So even if we don't specifically say, yeah, go ahead and do that terrible thing, we're still kind of complicit.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
But the encyclopedia pushes back on that. They're like, just because we give someone authority to govern doesn't mean we're saying, hey, go ahead and break any moral rule you want.
It's not a blank check.
Exactly. It's like if you hire a debt collector, you're giving them permission to try and get your money back. But you're not saying it's okay to use violence or threats. So just because we vote for someone or live in a democracy doesn't mean we're automatically okay with them doing whatever they think is necessary.
Right, but the stakes are so much higher in politics.
They are.
It's not just about money.
It's true. But the encyclopedia makes the point that, truly earth-shattering decisions are pretty rare.
Mm.
And confining dirty hands to just politics, it doesn't really hold up. It can happen in other areas of life, too.
Okay, so this idea that we, the citizens, are consenting to these immoral actions when there's a supreme emergency, is that really true? Like, do we all agree on that?
There's one philosopher, Dennis Thompson. He's pretty confident about it.
Okay.
He says that dirty hands, politicians are acting, quote, not only for us, but with our consent. Not only in our name, but on our principles.
But that just seems so improbable.
It does, right. The encyclopedia calls them out on that. They're like,
Yeah.
where's the evidence for this consent?
Eh.
Especially in a diverse society where people have all kinds of different moral beliefs.
Yeah.
They use this example of torturing a child in a ticking bomb scenario. It's a classic thought experiment, but it really makes you think. Like, are we really saying that everyone would be okay with that, that it would reflect our principles? And even if some people would say yes, what about everyone else?